the rationale behind deleting my WhatsApp account. So when I was about, I don't know, 14, 15, WhatsApp began to appear. Of course, there have been chat apps before. There was also SMS before. When I was about 12, Sony Ericsson, for example, came out with their phones, or the first Sony Ericssons began to appear, which were kind of the first, you could call it kind of a pre-smartphone, but the phones that everybody had and that were seen as mobile phones. Of course, there were before other phones, but the Sony Ericsson were, I think, at least in my perception, the ones that kind of made it into the smartphone era. Of course, then smartphones really began to appear later on. And then also how phones were used probably changed a bit. For reference, when I was very little, phones were kind of the size of bricks. So my father had one of these phones, basically wireless phones, and it was just like a brick, and then it didn't work anymore. And we had it just for playing around in our room. So then eventually chat began to appear, and I have now developed a thesis or a hypothesis on kind of my social development and the interaction with chat I had. And it in short goes like this. If I am here on the left side and I have a certain need for human communication, and there is another human on the other side, and there are multiple things one can do. Now, I think it makes sense to now look at this from the lens of choice architecture. Choice architecture is kind of a recent phenomenon, or recent concept, I would say, that happened in the last maybe 10 years, at least in my perception. And it is kind of the following concept. If you have at any point in time a choice, then certain choices might be harder, certain choices might be easier. And at least if you assume that your willpower is kind of given, and of course you can now say that willpower replenishes, and there is also a recent Huberman episode on willpower and tenacity on this specific topic, but the result is kind of this. If at any point in time you can make a decision, you can make the decision in many ways. And you probably make the decision that is easier compared to one that is harder. At least given that you have to make many decisions, and that over time, therefore, you only have a limited resource, or you in general just have limited resources. Either it's your brain power, it's your physical ability, and so on and so forth. So how you architect those choices in everyday life, therefore, over time influences how you live your life and what kind of results you will have. So if, for example, you don't have a bed, or you are on Mars, then it will be very hard to either sleep in a bed or eat cookies on Mars. So these are very plain examples, but if, for example, I would be on the moon or on Mars, then I would not have such a problem with not eating sweet things and sugar and so on and so forth, like I had in the last years. And the question, therefore, is how does one influence these choices one makes again and again and again, but maybe also the choices one makes once in a lifetime. But of course, the compound effect is probably bigger in the choices one has to make again and again and again. So therefore, in terms of sweets, for example, I just don't try to buy them. And if I buy them, I know I will eat them. So the idea is to just not buy them. Recently, for example, I've been buying a lot of fruit, but that's not really the point of this idea. The point of this video, not so much this idea, is that if I am here and there is the need for social connection, and here is another person, then whatever I will do is again basically under the influence of choice architecture. So I probably, within a given system or within my limited capabilities, will do the thing that fulfills the need for a social connection need the easiest. So if I, for example, could go on a run, and I could go twice as hard on the run or not twice as hard on the run, then it will be easier to not go twice as hard on the run. And how this now translates to social connection, I think, is, or it's not so much what I think, it's what I think happened to me, or not so much happened to me, but what seems to be apparent out of out of the experience I have with interaction with normal people, and also with calling people, and also with emailing people and chatting people. I would say that talking to other people in real life, and also talking to strangers maybe, is comparably hard. Then there might also be something that is a little bit easier, which might be talking to friends, for example, because you don't have the risk. You don't have to bear the risk that the other person could reject you. Now, there also seems to be a evolutionary argument. If you are, or you lived in a tribe of 100 people, and some of these 100 people, or one of these 100 people rejected you, or it became clear that out of the 10 potential partners, already 9 rejected you for some reason, then the 10th partner, for example, might have some reason to suspect that there might be something with you, to maybe then construct the argument that it's not a good idea to live with you, for example. Now, talking to not strangers might be a little bit easier, but then there are also these other options that are now available. Now, already when I was in school, for example, I did not talk that much to people in school, of course also a little bit, but what I began to see, not necessarily what I began to see, what I think kind of happened is the following. I often would not ask my friends in school whether they wanted to play in the afternoon. But instead, what I did eventually, more and more, is I just called them afterwards. Because calling was kind of easier than talking to them in person, face to face. Because then there would also be others involved. So I would have to approach them and so on and so forth. Not that I was a super shy child, but I began to just call people after school instead of talking to them in school. Of course, sometimes there is the argument that maybe there is no time, but you could also just go to the person if you already plan to maybe play football in the afternoon, or soccer, depending on your location of residence. Now, as I then began to call people, I basically sometimes called like 4 friends if the first one didn't have time, and maybe I also nudged friends therefore slightly into a guilt trip with calling to them directly, because you can call them directly, and also there might be someone listening, so there might be a situation where the friend is maybe pressured into playing with me soccer in the afternoon, if he in the beginning even didn't want to. So I don't know what to make of this really, but or what to make of my past behavior of this, but I mean, I also established a few friendships over the years, so it might have been beneficial, probably in the long term, at least for me. So now the question is, if there is calling, is there also something that is even easier? That's the simplest way I can say it. Is there something that is easier, that does the same thing but is easier? And the next iteration of this is obviously reducing the resolution of human communication even down, and making it more convenient for both sides. So both in the face-to-face interaction with strangers and also with friends, but now also with talking to people on the phone, you still have real-time interaction. But if you now take the real-time interaction part out of the equation, then you have basically 2 parties, which over time, so if these are the 2 parties, and if we now assume this is time, then they can basically ping-pong back and forth like this. And as time goes on and they ping-pong back and forth, they can easily and conveniently now talk to the other person whenever they want to talk to the other person, now also with voice messages. Now, this seems to be kind of an improvement, because then you can talk to the other person. The problem is just that there is, I think, a huge information loss. And this huge information loss is due to the fact that if I now am on this end, I don't get any feedback. So I have to wait for the feedback. And now what I also have to do is I have to prioritize to which person I am giving feedback, So if I have 20 WhatsApp messages, or maybe 10, or one group where there is constantly chat appearing, then I constantly need to figure out what is important and what is not important. Whereas if I'm talking to one person, then I'm talking to one person to resolve this issue. But if I am doing this, then the issue is basically ever ongoing. So there is basically an ongoing conversation that is never ending. And every WhatsApp chat I ever had is basically one of these conversations. And the question is then, at which point do you end a conversation, and why would you even end a WhatsApp conversation? Or do you just not respond and ghost everybody forever? That's actually what my strategy then in the end was. I just ghosted everybody forever unless there was something important to discuss. And I also felt bad about this, and I imagine many others might feel bad about this too. But there is something else. This is actually a story now I want to discuss. And this story is that as I then began to chat, I think it makes sense, yes? So there were the first social networks, and when I basically was in 6th, 7th or 8th grade. I never got into SMS because SMSs were costly. So I would have to pay for these, and therefore I didn't use them. And they also were fairly expensive. That's something to be said about. These days, for example, I have a flat rate. So now the choice architecture of texting or chatting people, at least with SMS, is slightly different. But of course there have then been chat services or platforms. So you could chat on the first social platforms, eventually then also Facebook and other social media platforms. But before this, there were like local versions of Facebook, for example, in the country where I grew up. So what I did eventually, and what I retrospectively now in the last few months saw, or to a certain extent I think noticed, is that instead of talking to people, now going back to this model, instead of talking to people, I deviated more and more from actually real life conversation. And in the afternoon, for example, I would just chat with people. And before, I at least would have called these people. But then I just chatted with them because there was no time anyway, because I had so many things to do, and also because I now chatted with people just in the afternoon. Whereas before, I just didn't. All of this chatting was just non-existent before. And what this chatting, what this lower resolution human communication actually then replaces is my time I could have spent with real life interactions. And now, of course, there is an argument to be made that if you have WhatsApp, for example, or another chat, or if you chat on Skype, what I did in the beginning, for example, is that, of course, it's more efficient because you can talk to many people at the same time. But let's face it, you're not solving cancer, or you're not curing cancer when you're Skyping most of the time. So what I'm trying to say with this is, of course, this is a simplistic argument. Not solving cancer is a very high extreme, or a very extreme of productivity, or it just seems like something everybody thinks it should be done. So therefore, I just mentioned it here. What I'm trying to say is that, of course, there are multiple sides to human communication. There is the social, the need for social interaction. There also might be a certain component of fun involved, just it being recreational maybe. There also just might be other parts involved, actually playing soccer, for example, so physical activity, or working together towards a common goal, or playing music together, or learning together for school or for university, or and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say here is that eventually I deviated to lower and lower resolution communication. And what I think to some extent this did is that it prohibited my otherwise normal social behavior that would have resulted out of social interactions that were actually face-to-face. So let's just think about this in numbers. I don't want to self-diagnose myself here. This is not a video about this. And I also don't think I have a problem with social interactions and so on and so forth. It is just that I think that if I would have not have these options available, because these were easier, and I also recently had kind of an idea how to conceptualize this, and this idea in short is the following. Instead of just saying, okay, these are two-dimensional choices, let's say there are ways you can go, and these ways are three-dimensional, but because most of Earth is mostly flat, I think it makes sense to visualize this in a tunnel system. So you are in a tunnel system, and now you can go up, you can go basically sideways, you can go down. Sideways is taking a little bit of energy, just normal walking. Down is actually faster because there is also gravity involved, so you don't have to put in that much effort per meter you go or per unit of distance you go. And up is even harder because you have to work against gravity. So there are choices that are hard, and of course there can be different inclines. So there can be just no incline, there can be a little bit of an incline, or it could go straight up. That's basically in three-dimensional space all we have, and then it could also go straight down, so a choice that is basically a tunnel to the ground or whatever this is. And you could also now think or conceptualize that maybe choices that are harder for us due to multiple reasons, but also because they train our mind, very simplified, might actually get us up in life. So if we think about now 2 dimensions, so we take out a cut, and basically all paths I can go are now in this level, then you could maybe, very simplified, say that choices that are harder bring you further. So you basically have a value dimension now, and this value dimension is up, better, and low is lower value. So what you could say, for example, that now in terms of choice architecture, you want to architect your choices in a way that, now again taking the value dimension out and just having the 3-dimensional thing that represents basically how difficult something is, how difficult a choice is per unit of thing you invest into a choice, or you have to then do if you perform this choice or this task or whatever it is. Then, so if we just take this model again and apply it to chat, not necessarily to chat, but to human interaction, then I think over time, if you compound all the different interactions you have, and you replace some of these and more of these with things that are easier and easier, and still kind of fulfill this social connection need, but not really. So they kind of, you could also say it's a kind of trick that these things play on your brain, because they kind of make you feel like you're present with someone, like you just talk to your family, for example, but actually you didn't really talk to your family because you just chatted back and forth, and maybe you exchanged a picture, but at least in these days already, it just could have been written by artificial intelligence, for example. Artificial intelligence trained on WhatsApp chat history probably could produce something that sounds very similar to the other person already. Maybe not the images yet, and maybe some of the images could already be reproduced. And of course there have to be many different details about if, for example, a friend of yours sends you him on a mountain, there has to be many details that have to be involved, him hiking on a mountain, a picture of him, to get this right. But what I'm trying to say here is that because easier choices are easier, we tend to make the easier choice. There is also an economic, or much more an evolutionary argument to be made. You don't want to waste resources, you want to be efficient, therefore being lazy is kind of the algorithm that probably leads to, over time, better outcomes. Of course, now, if you are here already with a given set of genes and so on and so forth, it might be useful to use these in a way that sometimes is hard, because then you might train your mind to go harder, and you also might do many different things to your brain and so on and so forth. But what I eventually realized, such a big word, when I looked back at all these interactions I had, is that beginning from maybe 12, 13, 14, 15 years, basically when chat began to appear, also when puberty began to appear, so of course there are different variables, and maybe it's just puberty that began to appear, maybe it's the fact that everybody else was at this point then taller than me, but there was only, at least in my class, and there was only one girl that was like at least as tall as me, so I grew very late, that's what I'm trying to say, and this might also have had an impact, and there also might have been hormones involved, and I don't know. But also, what might have been involved is that I was comfortable with talking to people basically for all my life. But then, with classmates, I began to more and more talk to at least certain people just with chat. So I chatted with people all the time, but at school I didn't even talk to them. And this happened until my basically late puberty, until me being an early adult. I would sometimes just not converse with some people at all. And there was one instance, for example, where I talked with one person over over multiple months, maybe even years, basically as chat. We chatted maybe 1 hour every day, maybe it was 20 minutes sometimes, maybe it was only 10 minutes. I can't remember that well. But eventually I figured we could get kind of romantically involved. So it was a girl, and it basically, there was, retrospectively, also looking back, there was basically almost no connection. The only connection that happened was through chat. And through chat, because there is so many missing information, and because maybe I also didn't learn how to communicate properly, I just thought something different. So what I had in mind of our non-existent relationship was quite different from what the other person had in mind. The other person had in mind that there was nothing, and I had in mind that there could be something. And this slight difference eventually resolved itself in a real-life conversation. And so I think this might have been one of the things I just missed. I just didn't see. I just didn't recognize. I didn't realize, and this might have been the effect of chat. So what I recently said is that what is the big downside of not having WhatsApp, for example? Could I delete my WhatsApp account? It seemed like such an illogical step. Now, for many of you, deleting WhatsApp might seem not such a big step. So WhatsApp is only one messenger. You could also use something else like Instagram or iMessage. But where I live in Europe, WhatsApp, and especially in my country, WhatsApp is basically the standard way of communicating via chat, via the phone. Email is also here, but almost nobody, I would say, at least in my age group, does write over Facebook. Most people don't use Facebook anymore. Some people are on Instagram, especially people younger than me. But basically everybody and their mom now uses WhatsApp. And we also, for my family, for example, we had WhatsApp groups, and for different kind of friend groups, we had WhatsApp groups. So it was not a very easy step, but I nevertheless decided to do it. Part of the reasoning was also that over the last years, I did have to prevent myself constantly from not going onto WhatsApp. If I was at the library, I looked at WhatsApp. And of course, now everybody knows this. Everybody has the same experience, and therefore it's kind of just very common that everybody basically that there is basically a behavior that most people try to control, but it's not really controllable. And I saw this on myself, and I often just looked maybe 20 times into WhatsApp in a day, maybe sometimes 100 times, maybe sometimes 200 times. And sometimes I just sat there, depleted of neural energy, as Huberman calls it, the neural energy part, not the depletion part. And I would just sit on my phone, I would just go into WhatsApp, see if somebody wrote me. Then I would switch to email, see if somebody wrote me. Then I would switch to the internet and see if the latest blog I followed, or if the blog I followed had something new on it. And then I would switch back to WhatsApp, and then I would switch back to email. And this was just ridiculously stupid behavior, but I nevertheless did it. And I did it hundreds, thousands of times. And the question is, why is this the case? So obviously, to some extent, this is not rational. And because it is not rational, we could now assume that there is something that causes this irrational behavior. And the cause for this irrational behavior is maybe that it is fulfilling the social need to some extent. It is fulfilling the need for maybe a little bit of dopamine, the hope for a little bit of dopamine, if it is dopamine. But I'm not that qualified to talk about this. Maybe I would defer to Andrew Huberman, to his podcast about this. Andrew Huberman is a Stanford professor, and he talks about neuroscience mostly on this podcast. Now, this degradation of kind of human communication that happens if you replace. So I think that has been happening in my life. I replaced more and more real-life interactions with WhatsApp. And I therefore didn't have that many if I have a certain amount of time in a given day, then this fixed amount of time, if there is 30 minutes on WhatsApp doesn't sound like much to me. I often would spend like 40 minutes, sometimes writing a little bit more. And also, if you write a letter, for example, I tried writing letters a few times in my life, not that many, but it takes like an hour. Or you write something down that seems like 2 pages, and it takes like 2 hours to write it down. So also writing WhatsApp, you don't want to make mistakes, and because it's so linear and because it's now saved forever, basically, you don't want to make mistakes. And everybody can screenshot things and put them on Instagram, and you might get thrown into prison for writing things to somebody. So there is also a certain amount of risk involved, whereas in real life conversation, most people are not carrying their phone recording around all the time. So of course there are other people involved, and the other person might also remember, but the other person might also forget. So in real life conversation, you have kind of a bigger leeway to some extent, probably, because most people just can't remember every single word somebody said ever in their life. Whereas in WhatsApp, it is all stored. In chat, it is all stored. So there is also a little bit less of a risk. And because the risk is so high in chat, maybe it also transfers to real life conversations. And what I began to notice is then over the last years, sometimes I had periods where I was very socially active, and it was very easy for me to go to random people on the street and to talk to them, or to... Yesterday, for example, I offered somebody a bike pump because I saw him on the ground. I would have not done this like a few months earlier. And I had to make a conscious, rational attempt to now socially engage a little bit more with people. Of course, I still have a few friends I come back to and I talk to like for more than a few minutes. But what I am trying to say is that I think to some extent it prohibits that the social drive we have in us, if I call it social drive, that it is kind of properly fulfilled. So by having this available all the time, similar to having chocolate available, if I would have cookies in front of me every single day and these cookies would never go away, it would be harder to eat nutritionally accurate or nutritionally rational. But if I instead... And the same is true with WhatsApp, because I have WhatsApp in my pocket all the time. It's like social connection, just look here into WhatsApp. And then the hurdle that seems very big, and that actually is also very big if you compare it to WhatsApp, of talking to people in real life, then just becomes that much bigger. But if you then get into talking to people in real life again, with talking to people randomly on the streets, making comments you would just not make otherwise, because you're so focused, and because you don't have time, because you spend like 30 minutes a day on WhatsApp, if it's 30 minutes. The same is true for many other areas of life, I think, where whenever there is a thing that is comparably easy and that seems to fulfill the need also, then it is obviously easier to choose this, because it's easier to choose this. And as it is easier to choose this, and it seems to at least promise similar result, we take the easier route, not because we're dumb, not because we're lazy, but because lazy is a useful algorithm. So I deleted WhatsApp, and it has now been a few weeks, and apart from a few people, most of everybody didn't even notice, because I, over the last years, had reduced my WhatsApp messaging so much that basically nobody, I think, expects me to answer them. Maybe expect from my parents, who then call me every now and then. But it's almost ridiculous. I thought of this as this very big thing that had this big impact in my life, and it probably will have a big impact. And there are many downsides to now not having WhatsApp. But there is also still SMS. So most of everybody, I assume, at least has a WhatsApp flat. Not a WhatsApp, but an SMS flat. And I also can write emails to people. Of course, now I don't have emails of all the people I would have the numbers and WhatsApp chat availability from, but at least to this day, it has been a very, very positive impact. At the same time, I basically also quit social media almost entirely. Whereas before I sometimes would sit in the evening here and eat and watch 2 hours of something. And that's basically on the lower side of my social media consumption. In the last few weeks, I barely did anything of it. And this has been very hard to avoid. Social media, for example, watching random stuff on YouTube. Or also trying to not get onto Instagram, for example. And other things that are similarly structured in terms of in terms of the kind of short-term reward they give you versus the otherwise occurring rational approach of, okay, I have this much time, what do I do with this time? It's like almost that I accepted that I was not able to do things anymore according to what I thought as the proper way, the right way to do them. And quitting may be one of these sources of dopamine that gives me kind of this false reward, but actually over the long term depletes my baseline dopamine, maybe, has been a very good change, actually. And maybe I go back to WhatsApp, and the only thing I actually lost, I think, from this experiment is all the history. All the history of these conversations. And maybe there also might be some information, some banking information, for example. Somebody sent me once and now I can't find it anywhere. But I made this decision, I think, very rationally. I was in the library and I wasted this much time on WhatsApp. Every single day I try to not go on WhatsApp. Basically, every single hour I try to not go onto WhatsApp. Not on my notebook. I didn't want it on my notebook. I didn't want it on my phone. I just didn't want it basically at all. I just wanted to get rid of it. I also wanted to get rid of this chatting back and forth. It just seemed so annoying to me over the years because I knew what effect it had on me. So I just quit.